Cool. Hey everyone. So this is Sadiqa here. Thanks, Priyanka, for the introduction. So starting today, we're going to talk about test automation basics. We're going to go into very basic about test automation, the fundamentals about test automation. So before we start, I think the main question is what is test automation and why do we need it, right? Um, just yeah. So why do we need test automation? Test automation is basically like all your manual testing that you're doing, the test cases, creating a script that can run either in the background or you run it manually to basically have your scripts running behind the scenes, right? Where you're not actually going and testing this your test cases manually. So why do we need to automate our manual test cases? Why is it required? So in the current market, the software development and release cycles are much faster, much shorter, where you have releases happening either weekly or daily releases also. And manual testing is time intensive and also difficult to scale. It takes a lot of time to run your manual tests on different environments, different versions of the tool or different versions of the app, right? What versions you're supporting. Sometimes, if you're running a web app, you have multiple versions of Chrome or different kinds of browsers that you support. So, running manual testing in these scenarios, it's a time-consuming job. The other thing with manual testing is because you're running the same scripts again and again, sometimes it becomes repetitive and it can get boring. And as human, we tend to, miss certain things when we are repeating the same task. So it is possible that we might miss some critical bugs, which could leak into production. So that is another disadvantage of manual testing. There is a constant need to improve the testing pace and also the accuracy of testing results, right? So this is where automation helps us. It also helps us in having a wider coverage and higher reliability of our test results. And test automation also helps with continuous testing. We have faster feedback, a smaller cycle of testing phase, wherein many projects face this issue where the testing phase or the testing process is not given a lot of time, and thus, the testing team is constantly complaining that we don't have enough time to complete all the tests, to run all the tests. So this is where automation comes into picture, where you could be running your tests and simultaneously executing manual testing. So this is where automation really helps. So moving on in today's topic, what we are going to cover is we're going to talk about tool selections. Then we're going to move into framework selection. Once we have talked about these, we're going to talk about scope of automation, which is very important to define your automation scope as well as your automation process. And then we'll talk about the design and development phase of automation, and finally, the goal of automation. So starting with tool selection, right? Today, when you think of starting an automation process in your company or for your product, there are multiple tools available in the market. You have Selenium, for example, for the web app, you have Playwright, you have UFT, and there are many more tools that are available in the market, not just for web app, even for mobile testing, for API testing. So how do you know which tool should you go with? The other question you need to ask is, should you go with open source or paid, right? This is a very important question. Is your company willing to go for a paid tool? If not, then you have the option of open source. There are a few companies which do not really like open source. So I think if you're thinking of looking into an open source tool, one of the things to do is look into your company's policy and procedures around open source and then pick the tool. So you have now so many choices to select from. You need to decide which tool works best for you. Which tool is best for you to invest your team's time in training and learning. One of the main options in selecting a tool is probably your previous experience, right? You have worked on some tool. You've used it and you know how it works, but that's not the only option you need to go with while selecting a tool, because the other things you need to look on the broader picture, how that tool is going to work. Is that tool going to work for your product, your application that is under test? How is the tool handling the reporting and results? Does it have an inbuilt reporting tool, or do you have the capability of integrating it with a third party tool? So you need to look into those things. the test that you develop, whether it's easy to understand, easy to share, how difficult is it to integrate with your existing environment, for deploying your tests or running your automation test, how easy it is to integrate with the CI/CD pipeline. If your dev team is already using a CI/CD pipeline, the tool that you're using, can it be integrated with it? So there are multiple questions that you need to ask yourself, and then come up with the tool that you're going to work with, right? Selecting a tool is very similar to something that you're going to buy for yourself. You're not just going to go and pick the first thing, right? You're going to look at that thing, read reviews, analyze or read its description, how the product works, everything. So selecting a tool is pretty similar. I think one of the things, best thing we have now is like we have these online platforms where you can go and see there is a comparison of tool done. So maybe go through it, see its pros, its cons, how does it work with your specific application, is it going to work with the tool or with your application or not? So read all those things. The other thing that I personally look at tool before picking it is how is the support team, right? If I run into some issues while using it, am I going to have a quick response from the support team? If it's open source, how actively are the help teams responding, right? And that could actually make or break your automation tool selection, because sometimes if you're stuck with something and you don't get answers, then you're just stuck. You don't know how to proceed. So probably do like a thorough research on it, and then shortlist the tool that you want to work with. So now that we've talked about tool selection, moving on, we need to select a framework for our automation. So what is framework, right? Framework is basically a guiding tool for your, or guiding script for how your automation scripts are going to work, your coding guidelines, or how you're going to arrange your test data, your test environment, your scripts, those kind of rules. So that is basically your framework, your structure, right, for your test automation. So currently in the market, we have multiple frameworks, and again, you need to select which one works best for your application. The first one that I have here is Record and Play. It's not really a framework, but there are some tools that provide this feature where you could record the application, your test script, right? Whatever steps you're executing, you play a record button, you could record it, and then you stop record at the end of the test case, and then you could run it. Um, the disadvantage of this method, record in place, that the test cases that you record are very brittle. So sometimes when you're rerunning it for your testing purpose, the test could actually fail, not because the application had an error, but because your script is no longer functioning as expected. Either sometimes when an object is not recognized, the record and play usually goes with a coordinate or relative position, those kind of things. And these are not very good way to identify an object, right? So they are very brittle and they break easily. Also, maintenance of recorded and scripts are not very easy. Plus, the data is hard coded. When you're recording, you enter the data and that data stays there. So if you want to convert that data into to be able to pick external data, then you have to modify the script. So you need to know how to modify it, where to modify it, those kind of things. The advantage of record and play is sometimes when you're using a tool which supports record and play, if you're stuck with identifying an object or in your automation process, you could always use record and play to see how it recognizes that object or how it is automating it, right? And then use that in your automation script development. That's about record and place. The other frameworks that we have is data driven, keyword, modular, hybrid, and behavior driven. So let's talk about these frameworks. So starting with data driven, right? So in data driven framework, you have a test script that is going to be executed. It's the same test script that you will execute for multiple data, right? Different data sets. A simple example is going to be a login test case where you need to test multiple scenarios of valid username, invalid username, valid password, different combinations of password, right? So those kind of things. So you just develop one script. You're basically writing just one script, and then you have a test data set. It could be a text file, a CSV, an Excel sheet, or a database, anything. And your script is going to connect to that data set and then run the script for all these datas and give out the result, right? For this script to work efficiently, one thing to keep in mind is do not hard code your data into the test script. Then it fails the purpose, right? You're not able to run it for multiple data sets and change your data set when required. Uh, in this data-driven framework, your test data is separated from your script logic. So the advantage is that you can constantly change your data or add data, change your data. But this is a very specific scenario, right? You're going to run it for this scenario. The data-driven framework is going to work for scenarios where you need to test a script for multiple data set or different data sets. But that's not always the case. That's part of a testing process, but that's not your whole testing process, right? Um, so moving on to the next framework that we're going to talk about is keyword driven. So in keyword driven, what you do is your application under test for each element or each object of your application, right? You're going to create a keyword. Again, taking a simple example of login where you have to navigate to a URL, enter username, enter password, and then click login or click reset button, right? So then you're going to create a keyword for each of these elements, navigating to the URL, and then for the username text box, for the password text box, and then for login button, right? So each of these objects are going to have a unique keyword. And your test case, along with the test case name, you're going to have your keywords listed down. And for each keyword, you're going to have another column which is going to describe the object properties or the keyword associated with that object, right? How you define that object. And then you're going to define the action that has to be taken. And the third column is going to be the input that you need to enter if it is applicable for that particular keyword. So if you look at the screenshot here, right, there's a simple keyword driven framework done here in Excel sheet where reset login application is the name of the test case. And then it has these four keywords, which is go to URL, set text, and then click. And for set text, one of the set text, the keyword or the object description is the username. The next one is password. So you could reuse the same keyword and then pass the object description to it. And then your script in the background is going to pick the keyword for each test case and then the object description and accordingly perform the action that you need to perform. So in this case, when you have set text, the keyword is going to define. So it's going to set that particular text value and you're passing the value here in the value column as demo. Um, so, and then this, similarly in click, if you see here, you're clicking the reset button. So in the background, the script is going to call the click keyword, identify the object, and then click on it. So it's basically you're defining keyword for each object that you have. And for those keywords, you're going to give the object description or unique name or CSS path or any of those object, how you're going to identify it, right? You're going to pass that in another column and then the action to be performed. Either you could set it in the keywords name or you could have a separate column where you define what action needs to be performed. So the biggest disadvantage of keyword-driven framework is that it gets very difficult to maintain as your application grows. Imagine you have like 5, 6 pages, right, in your application where you're navigating and performing actions. There are certain keywords maybe you could reuse, but then if there is a small change to be done for that keyword, you have to go in and change all the keyword at multiple locations. A simple example, like in this screen here, right? If the set text username, the name has changed, then you need to go to every test case that is calling this a particular element or keyword and change it. So it becomes very difficult to maintain. And one of the advantages of keyword driven is that a non-technical person, right, a person who doesn't know anything about scripting can also go and start automating test cases because they just need to use these keywords that are created or create a keyword and provide its description and then they can start writing test cases which are automated. So that is an advantage, but maintenance it takes for larger product or to scale this keyword driven actually is the biggest disadvantage, and that's the reason it's not used that commonly. So moving on from keyword driven, we have a modular framework. So in modular framework, what you're going to do is the application that you're testing, right? You're going to divide it into smaller functionalities or features or units. So your larger application, you divide it into multiple modules, small modules, and for each module, you're going to write your test scripts. So for each functionality, you have a separate test script that is created, and each of them are an independent test script, so they could run on their own. And then when you need to do an end-to-end test, you just combine those test scripts and you run your larger test scripts, right? Um, so this framework, the biggest disadvantage is you need to have good scripting language or good coding background, right? To understand how to divide your functionality into different modules and then write the code for different modules and how you're going to run the scripts. The other disadvantage of this is in case there is a failure in one module, when you're running a larger script, it can take some time to realize which particular module is failing and then debugging it. So that could be time consuming. But then again, on the plus side, because you can run tests for your individual modules, if there is a change done in suppose module one here, so you could run all the tests for module one and verify that module one is working as expected. So this is modular framework where you're going to divide your application into smaller parts and then develop automation scripts for it. So moving on, we have hybrid framework. So hybrid framework is nothing but a combination of any of those previous mentioned framework, right? You could have keyword driven framework with the data in an external file. So that becomes a hybrid framework. Or you could have a modular framework where you have your test data in a separate file and then your object description or object repository in a different file. So a simple hybrid framework screenshot here, which shows like there is an object repository. There's a separate file for your global variables, and then you have test data in a separate file or a database. You have common functionalities or libraries in one location, and then you have your scripts for each module in one location. And then you have a driver script which calls the test script for each module and runs it. So hybrid is basically a combination of all these frameworks. So you're taking the plus point or cons of all the frameworks or a combination of those frameworks and developing a framework, customized framework based on your requirement, right? Maybe you have few test cases that need to be data driven, right? And then you have few modules that need to be tested individually. So you could take a combination of these to create a framework, and that is called hybrid framework. So this is one of the most commonly used framework, a combination of different kinds of framework, just based on your application and your requirement. Um, and then coming to the last kind of framework, which is behavioral driven development. In this, what you do is instead of just directly developing your test scripts, right, you focus more on how a user is going to use your application. And your tests are written in simple language based on the functionality and acceptance criteria. A simple example is Gherkin language, right, where you have given, when, then. So for each step that you write in the background, you have a script that will be running. The advantage of this is it's easier to collaborate between different teams like product, your dev team, as well as the QA team, right? QA team is developing the script, but a product person can go and look at the script. It's in simple language. So if they need to add additional tests, they can just take the test steps, right, from different tests and create their own test and run it. So that's the advantage of behavior driven framework. But again, with behavior driven framework, the user who's developing the framework needs to have good scripting knowledge and also a good understanding of how the behavior driven framework works. Like in case if you have you're using Cucumber or Gherkin framework, so you need to have a deep understanding of it. So in this, the learning curve is a little steep, but otherwise it works well for teams where they have non-technical users also executing their automation scripts. So these are the types of framework and their overview. So now that we've talked about framework and tool selection, right? Um, you have looked at the tool, you've read the reviews of the tool, you've understood how the tool works. But before you finalize the tool or the framework for your automation process, make sure you conduct a proof of concept, right? Take a couple of scripts, 2, 3 test cases, maybe high priority or very commonly used test cases, and then try to automate them using the tool that you have. You don't have to implement it in the exact framework, but maybe like have a high level framework structure for it and try to run those tests, automate those tests, and then run those tests, see how it works with your application. Did you run into some issues? So make a note of all those things, and that'll help you understand the tool much better and make it easier for you to select the tool, right? The other thing that I personally like to follow is document the whole process of tool selection, framework selection, make a note of pros and cons of each tool that I've looked at. Even if I've just done a research, right, I've read about it. So I make a note of it, like why I'm not going with this for proof of concept. The reason being that somewhere down the lane, you run into some issue with your existing tool or existing framework structure, and then someone questions that, hey, why did you select this tool? So it's very difficult to remember the reasons after a certain time, but you always have a document to go back and refer and look at the pros and cons. And you've also made a note of the support team email there, right? So you can reach out to them, those kind of things. So having that document is always good, especially for referring back. So now that we've talked about tool selection and then the framework selection, you have picked a tool, you've decided which framework structure works best for the application that you're going to test. You need to define the scope of your automation, right? What are you going to automate? So make sure that when you start your automation process, in your scope, you clearly define what test cases you're going to start with or what test cases you're going to prioritize for your automation. A few of the test cases that a good example to start with is the test cases that are business critical, right? Highly used test cases or high risk test cases that you're repeatedly executing for every release you need to execute it. It's yeah, and then test cases that are difficult to perform manually. So certain test cases, they might be difficult to execute manually, or they are easy to execute but they take a lot of time to run, right? So they're time consuming. So these are the test cases which actually make good candidate to start with your automation process. The other thing, maybe not initially, but something to keep in mind is, say if a bug was leaked into production, right, and it was defined as high or critical, then probably take that bug, review it, why it was leaked into production, was it covered by manual testing, and if not, then maybe add a test case for it, and then probably try to automate that test case if it is feasible to automate it. So add that into your automation pipeline. So we've defined scope of automation where we are talking about what we should automate, right? But it's also critical to know what test cases we shouldn't automate or we shouldn't start with the automation process. Um, so these test cases are unstable functionality, right? Where the functionality is constantly breaking or the results are not as expected always, right? Sometimes you get the right result and sometimes they're failing and you don't know why it's failing. So these test cases are not good automation candidates. There are certain features where the requirements are constantly changing. So these test cases are also, again, not good candidate for automation. And your new test cases, new features, right, that were just developed, they have not gone through a release cycle. The test cases were not executed manually even once. So probably hold off automating these test cases, wait for them to go through one cycle of manual testing. And once the application is stable for these new test cases, then maybe you can pick it for automation process in the next sprint cycle. So defining what not to be automate, what will not be automated is as important as defining what you're going to automate, right? Otherwise, your automation pipeline is going to be very flaky. It's going to fail, will require a lot of maintenance, a lot of work on your end, and will prevent the release cycle or the advantages of framework where you want test automation, where you want your release cycle to be shorter. It's going to not let you be able to meet that deadline of having quicker release cycle. So now that we've defined scope of automation, we're going to move into design and development, right? You have your tool, you have your framework, you've defined your scope. So what do you do next? So before you start automating or start writing scripts, right? Have some principles laid out for your framework design features. So have a coding guideline because you're not the only one working. You'll have a team working on it. So you need your coding standards to meet across the whole team, right? One of the easiest way to get coding guidelines is probably use the same coding guidelines that your dev team is following. And if they don't have one, then maybe you can create one coding guideline for your automation process or across the whole team, which also meets the dev coding guidelines. Define how you're going to handle test data, right? Are you going to have an external file? How are you going to generate that external file? Will you be using a database for your test data? Also define where your test scripts are going to run, right? The test environment. Is it going to run in the QA environment, or is it going to run in a pre-prod environment, or staging environment, which is a mirror of your production environment? So have that definition also done and set up. The other thing to work on is the schedule and timeline, right? So have a schedule of by when your basic framework structure is ready, and by when you'll have some test cases automated, by when you will be releasing the automation test scripts, and how you'll be automating or your whole application. So have a schedule for it and the timeline set beforehand, like a 3 month schedule, a 6 month schedule. So have that schedule done. And then also define what your deliverables are going to be, right? So you're going to automate your test scripts, but what are you delivering? Are you just going to deliver the test results? Are you going to deliver some additional reports of manual versus automation test cases, the bugs, how many bugs were caught by your automation scripts? Or is it just going to be automation script ran, it's a pass or fail? So those kind of things. So define your deliverables also before you start your actual automation process. So once you've done that, then you start working on setting up your automation framework, you start coding it, and then you start developing your test automation script, right? So then once you're in that phase, it's called the development phase. So now you're in an active development phase where you're constantly working on script development, script execution, and maintenance. So this phase is usually like done in sprints, where you're going to pick certain number of test cases each sprint, and then work on developing those test scripts. And once you have that development done, you're going to test out your scripts. Is it working as expected or not? Um, so each sprint, right, when you're making an effort estimate for the time taken to develop your automation script, make sure that you set aside certain time for your test execution and maintenance. So your test execution and maintenance is a constant process that will keep happening. It's not necessary that your scripts are failing, but it could be that the application has changed. Certain properties have changed, right? So you need to go back and update an existing test script. Or it could be that the data requirement has changed, so you need to add additional data. So there is some kind of maintenance constantly involved in automation. So make sure that you set aside a time for your test maintenance, as well as or maintenance of framework. As you're developing scripts, you realize that there are certain features that you could add which would enhance the features or functionalities of your framework. So always make sure that each sprint cycle or each script development cycle, you set aside some time for maintenance. And these three things, the script development, test execution, and maintenance, is they go hand in hand and are part of each phase of your sprint. So from there, now that we've talked about tool selection, framework development, design development, and your development work, we are finally going to talk about the goal, right? So what is the goal of automation? So the goal of automation definitely is to have faster release cycles, to produce quality results, accurate results, all those things. But something we should never forget is the goal of automation is not to eliminate manual testing, right? Manual testing is always going to be part of testing process. It's just to reduce the number of test cases that you're running manually. It's to reduce the time taken for manual testing, but not to eliminate manual testing. If you have all your test scripts automated, you still need to run some manual testing. Maybe it could be exploratory testing, ad hoc testing, because there could be certain scenarios that your test case is not covering, and your ad hoc testing or exploratory testing could catch certain critical bugs. So always keep that in mind. Even if you have automated all your test cases, still do some manual testing before each release. So that is the goal of your test automation. That is pretty much what I had for today. So opening the floor for any questions that you have.
Are there any open source all-in-one frameworks like an open source version of like Catalan Studio?
So I think there are multiple open source where you can kind of use it, but you would have to work on, or you have the open source tool, you might have to work on the framework, right? So you will have to develop the framework based on the application that you are testing. It's not easy for someone to design that framework for you because that constantly changes depending on the application that is being tested and how you're testing it. So you will have open source tools, but you will have to customize the framework based on your requirement.
Okay. As far as like scripts go, would you recommend like be like a DevOps team to like maintain the automated scripts, or is it not really like big enough? I guess it depends on the project, but would that be something that the DevOps team would handle, like for the I guess the CI/CD pipeline?
Yeah, so the DevOps team can help you with CI/CD pipeline. So they're going to, integrate your automation script into CI/CD pipeline if you have a DevOps team, right? If you don't have a DevOps team, like you mentioned, it again depends on the team. So if you don't have a DevOps team, then it's probably you who will have to take the initiative and the responsibility. So, but if you have a DevOps team, they can help you integrate your automation scripts into the CI/CD pipeline. And if there is any failure, they're going to raise an alert, but they probably will not be the ones who are going to debug the failure, right? You will have to go and do that on your own. But yeah, DevOps can definitely help with the integration process.
Okay.
From the chat, we have which studio was it that was referred to earlier, and what type of automation testing would it support?
So in the question, I think Kenneth asked about Catalan Studio, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you drop that in the chat, please, Kenneth?
Yeah, it does pretty much everything. Desktop, web, API, mobile. But it's a commercial package. Renorex Studio is another all-in-one, also commercial. That's why I was asking about open source, because I know like there